Hey CS51 TF, and welcome to my exploration portion of Pset 8. So I'm going to start off by running just my baseline implementation for the problems from 1 through 5. So this has no extensions, this is just the way my program runs with my implementation, and you'll see the data here. And I've saved it right here. It's called normal data, and you also see it towards the bottom here. So my first implementation, or first extension, had to do with flattening the curve. And basically, after we reach a certain point, in this case, once the number of infected people exceeds 120, the mortality rate increases. By how much? You can see it right here. It increases 20-fold, and that's a pretty drastic change, but that's just so that the effects of this increased mortality rate is far more apparent. And I'll run that right here. And we're really going to want to look at the mortality rate in this case, because you'll see that it's drastically increased. And also we want to look at the way the graph moves. So that light gray portion is the number of people that have died. And you'll see that it immediately starts increasing rapidly before plateauing, and then increasing again pretty rapidly, and then plateauing. So why is it? Why is the graph behaving this way? Well, this first peak, or this first steep increase, what's going on there is that we must start off with more than 120 people being infected, and that results us in using this higher 20-fold mortality rate. Hence why the mortality rate is so high and so steadily increasing. But that makes it so that more people end up dying than new people are being infected. So the number of people being infected is actually decreasing over time, so much so that it decreases and falls below this 120 number. That's when we see this plateauing effect happen, because now the mortality rate's going back to 2%. And that same behavior happens for this second increase and then plateau. And we see that 456 people ended up dying in this case. These are some outdated. This is some outdated data here, down here. Yeah, here's the most up-to-date data that shows the effect of flattening the curve. So very interesting. And this got me thinking of something that I actually learned in a history class, interestingly enough, but it has to do with the last pandemic. And I'm not talking about COVID, but the Spanish flu, actually, which basically the Spanish flu was so powerful, so potent, that it sort of killed itself. And that might sound a little interesting and a little counterintuitive, but basically, the mortality rate was so high that it ended up killing its host before the host could infect anyone else. So I want to implement that to see, does a high mortality rate decrease the number of infected people, or does a high mortality rate cause a virus to sort of burn itself out? So the way I'm doing that is I'm increasing the mortality rate from 2% to 30%. And we should see something very interesting happen. Something that corroborates with the pandemic that happened in 1918, which was the Spanish flu. So right off the bat, you'll see a high mortality rate, unbelievably high. Almost everyone that's infected seems to die, right? But by the end of it, you'll see that only 2 people are infected. So it's conceivable that if I let this program run for a longer period of time, this virus might eradicate itself, because it's just so potent and kills its host way before the host can infect someone else. And you'll see the mortality, the number of people that have died, 518. That's more than half the people in this original trial. So the final portion of my piece, that I decided to implement a vaccine in my simulation. And I did so by creating 2 new classes. The first one is shown right here, and it's called vaccinated. This, as the name suggests, represents a group of people that have gotten the vaccine but are currently not infected, and they are represented in a light blue color in my simulation. The second class that I've implemented is called vac-infec, and they represent the group of people that got infected in spite of getting the vaccine, and they're represented as a green color in my simulation. And you may be asking yourself, why would you create 2 new classes instead of altering previously existing ones? And that's because vaccinated people in the real world and in my simulation behave fundamentally different from unvaccinated people. And we can see that because of the 4 defining characteristics of a vaccinated person. The first one is increased resistance to the virus. No, I said increased resistance, not an outright immunity like the recovered class implements, but a resistance. So here's the part of the code, it's highlighted right now, that calculates whether a person that's been vaccinated is going to get infected or not. And this implementation is nearly identical to the implementation in the susceptible class. The one key difference is in this line right here. This line effectively means that the vaccine is 80% effective, or reduces the probability of you getting infected by 80%. The second key defining characteristic of a vaccinated person is that the status is temporary in the real world and in the simulation. And that's implemented right here. So after a certain amount of time, if you haven't gotten infected, you will lose your vaccinated status and you will become susceptible again. This is reminiscent of having to get a booster shot with like COVID or something. And it may be because the effectiveness of the vaccine wears off, or maybe the virus has mutated and is no longer effective. The vaccine is no longer effective. Now, the second two key defining characteristics are implemented in the vac-infect category. The first one, which interestingly enough, I didn't know until I started researching for this Pset, if you're vaccinated and you get infected, you actually have a reduced chance of transmitting that virus. So I've implemented that here by creating a new constant called C infectiousness vaccinated. So it's lower than the traditional infectious constant. Now, the third and final, and arguably the most important for our simulation, defining characteristic is a decreased severity of symptoms. So in the real world, if you get vaccinated and you contract the disease, the severity of your symptoms tend to be a lot lower. And I've implemented that right here. This portion of the code calculates the mortality rate, or calculates whether this person that is infected is going to die. And this line in particular, or this constant, it's a new constant that I've added, and it makes it so that it's half of what the normal mortality rate is. So you'll see that people that have been vaccinated and later contract the disease, they have a lower mortality rate. So let me run this program and you'll see, again, to remind you, light blue is people that have been vaccinated but don't have the disease. The green color is people that were vaccinated and still contracted the disease. And you can see the data right here. And I've amalgamated all of it down here. The main thing you want to compare it to is the normal data, the one without any extensions. And you'll see when we just ran the code with no extensions, 104 people ended up dying. But in this vaccinated case, which again, not everyone is getting vaccinated, you can see the light blue portion, it's maybe 15 to 20%. But that's still reduced the deaths. And now we're only at 74 deaths as opposed to 104. That's a pretty good impact. And you'll see right here, the total number of infected people, because it's split into two categories, infected people and infected people that got vaccinated, is 212. You compare that over here, which I believe it's at 275. So you can see we're making inroads on the number of infected people as well. So you could see that in the real world and in my simulation, the vaccine not only helps reduce transmissions, but it also helps decrease the mortality rate. And that is consistent with real world data. Also, when I submit this Pset, I'm gonna comment out all of my extensions. It'll still be there, but just for the sake of the unit test, I'm not entirely sure how it works. I don't want my extensions to penalize me. So all the code is there, it's just commented out. It's in its proper position, but yeah. Thank you for watching.